we there? Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this rather extraordinary screening. Can I just introduce the panel very quickly? On my right over here, Ben Anderson, who you saw in that remarkable film. Next to him, Will Pike, a former major in 3 Para, one of the very first people into Sangin when we first went in there, 2006. To my left, Dawood Azami, a senior broadcast journalist at the BBC and former bureau chief for the BBC in Kabul. And my name is Nick Fielding. I write a blog called Circling the Lion's Den, which is about Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'm a bit speechless after seeing that film. Maybe you all are too. It's a very dramatic and powerful film. Ben, I think the first thing is perhaps you'd just like to say a few words to the film. And then this is primarily a question and answer session, so you've got a lot of different kind of expertise on this platform. Please feel free to ask any questions. Initially, let's talk about the events and the incidents and the kind of background that's portrayed in this film, and then perhaps we can move on from there. Ben.
So I made the film last November and December. I spent 5 weeks in Sangin. I've been to Helmand, I think, 9 times over the last 5 or 6 years. And this wasn't the most physically demanding film, but it was the most depressing film to make because it was a very clear vision of what I think the next few years hold in Afghanistan. I think those of us that have been travelling there for a while have realised that the goals the Western nations set for ourselves out there weren't achievable, but what happened next was always guesswork to a certain extent. And I think the army, there were improvements in the army, and I'm told that after that there were operations where they were much more careful with their fires. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly if you look at the police and think about the police being given a free rein in Sangin, it's very depressing to think of all the. I mean, I've seen so much loss of life in Sangin, British, American, Afghan, so much destruction of property. And you think all of that for 5 or 6 years, if it's to hand power to those guys. And those guys were on heroin. One of them was shot a few weeks after I left, and they found a bag of heroin in his pocket. If it was all to hand over to those guys, then that's a very depressing state of affairs.
Can you just say very briefly before we ask questions whether you were subject to any kind of constraints in making that film?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, I haven't been out with the British for 5 years because there are so many constraints. You get a Ministry of Defence minder with you. I mean, I haven't even been given access to the British in a long time. You go out with the US Marines and, there are faults obviously, but they have the view that if you're willing to go out with them all day, for weeks on end, you can see everything, and you really do get to see everything. And I went out with the Afghan Army and police alone a couple of times. I mean, there were Marines close by, and they let you see everything as well. So no restraints whatsoever, and I didn't have to show it to anybody before it was broadcast. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to get some bad reaction afterwards, but no constraints at all.
Okay, well, with that, then can we open up questions? Stephen at the back there.
No, Ben, just to follow up on your point there, Stephen Gray here. You say that you'll get some bad reactions afterwards. I'm just interested in how the Marines themselves, you obviously latched onto the Major, who was a impressive character. He never seemed to look you in the eye. I don't know that was because of the way you filmed him, but that seemed to be his defining.
I mean, because I'm holding the camera and talking, it's difficult for them to look me in the eye because the camera is normally right there.
Okay, my question was obviously you met a wide range of Marines there. I am interested because you've been with the Marines a lot. You were with them in the battle for Marja. How do they see? I mean, apart from this Major we saw a lot of, what's their view of the way things have developed and their overall mission? Yeah.
Well, the first big surprise in Sangin on this trip was that there are less than 500 Marines now based in Sangin, and all of them, bar the 2 advisory teams, have pulled back to the main forward operating base, which they never leave. So they literally spend their days watching DVD box sets, lifting weights, bored out of their brains, and never going out, never mixing with Afghans, never training the Afghan Army or police at all. So most of them aren't even aware of what happens 500 metres outside the gate. Of the 2 teams who advised the police and army, Major Stuber was the only one who was really trying to change things. I mean, when I mentioned Chai boys to the others, they would say, try and find a police commander who doesn't abuse Chai boys. So what's the point in trying to stop it? He was the only one that really tried to do it. And he's probably seen less combat than any major I've ever seen in Afghanistan, and yet I think he was as traumatised as anybody because he really thought he could change things. And as you see there, I think he's powerless. They're all powerless. It's just 18 Marines go out every few days to advise the police. So on average, they visit each base once every 3 weeks, sometimes for just 15 or 20 minutes. So they have almost...
Were these Marines that had been there before, or were they...
No, as far as I'm aware, none of those guys had been there before. Which is the amazing thing, is that, you know, I've been going back and forth for years, and sometimes you see Marines arriving and they're asking the exact same questions you saw being asked in 2007. You know, which tribe are you? Which tribe controls this area? Who's the elder here? Who's, you know, exactly the same questions. And because of rivalry between nations and battalions and different Marines, they're not really sharing the information they've learnt on their 6-month tour. So it almost feels like they're just starting again. I don't know if that's such an issue with the British, but certainly with the Americans that was an issue.
Will, perhaps would you like just to talk a little bit about the contrast, possibly, or not, between that film and your experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I was in Helmand in 2006. I left the army in 2007, so I haven't been back there since. So in terms of currency, I would say that you're far more current than I am, and a number of guys in the audience here who've been there in Sangin much more recently than I have as well. So I'm not current. But I think my company went into Sangin for the first time on the 21st of June 2006. So I had 115 soldiers, and the first thing that we tried to do was to pull all the elders together. So literally the first thing I did was got hold of the district chief and said, bring me the elders, and we had about 60 of them. And then you're saying, look, we're here to try and do some good in the town. We're trying to bring law and order and all the sort of good cries that you want. But whilst you're saying that, you know that you've got no resource to deliver that. And so your ability to do anything is massively constrained. And I think that, and I could go on and on about it, but I think it goes up to the point about what is the goal, the strategic goal of the UK and the international community and the Afghan government, and how do we apply the right strategy to fit the goal. And I think that we sort of overextended very early, and simply didn't have the resource to do anything good.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but when you first went in there, wasn't it to rescue a government official who was a well-known child abuser?
Yeah, it was. Well, not quite. It was. The task was to. Well, I was supposed to go to Musakala to take over the base there, which is another story. And then Sangin started to kick off. The task that led us to go there, which was supposed to be a 2-hour mission, was to extract the nephew of the former chief of police who had been accused or allegedly was raping people in the town. So our task was to go and extract the nephew and his extended family from the town in a 2-hour task and then lift out. We went in there, extracted the nephew, and then we stayed.
Okay. Gentleman there.
Thanks very much for the film. I was just trying to get an idea of the wider picture around the film. I mean, it was very intense, and you focused in on that major, and all the details were shocking. Are you able to give us some other metrics around there? Sorry to sound a bit techie, but just to give us the bigger picture, because I never quite know what's going on in Afghanistan. Just in terms of overall casualties, I know it's Afghans dying, not our soldiers, but in terms of levels of violence, I don't know, bomb explosions, I'm not quite sure how you measure it. Can you try and put it in a bigger context for us?
Sure. Some of the figures for last year for the Afghan police and army, it's above 3,000. I think it's 3,400 Afghan police and soldiers killed, which is far more than the worst year British and Americans ever had there. And in terms of the problems seen in Sangin, I'd be interested to know what you think about this. I've been travelling all over Helmand and Kandahar for the last 5-6 years, and these problems are fairly common. And certainly I speak to people who have really been out and about and away from the forward operating bases, Afghan, Brits, Americans, and they're not particularly surprised by this stuff. It's certainly not a problem which only exists in Sangin.
I think it's important to state that Sangin is right on the periphery of the state, if you like, in Afghanistan. It is a bad lands place right at the So if you think we're trying to start off with the Kabul government to try and instill a sense of them delivering steadily better basic services to their people, steadily delivering better standard of law and order to their people from a very low base, that has to emanate from Kabul and perhaps from Kandahar and the other major cities and steadily creep out. Sangin, you're right at the extremity of the place, and there are obviously lots of towns beyond Sangin where we don't know what's going on. So I think that, and it's about time. Northern Ireland took us 35 years in our own country to stabilise to a point where we could pull out. And so, while shocking as this film is, are we really surprised that this place like that? What I would like to have seen in the film is an element of places like Lashnagar or Goresh or Kandahar or other parts to give some sort of context as to what it's like on the main arteries of the country, and to see how that's developed over the last 10 years.
Lydia, there's a microphone coming for you.
Forgetting the question of, I suppose, why all of this started, and I suppose the question changes now from why are we there to why are we leaving, and what are our constraints, what are our obligations when we go, do we have any? I mean, as you say, it took 35 years for Northern Ireland to stabilise. How many, what are the, I guess, metrics around that?
Well, I think, what do you think the aim is? What are we trying to achieve there?
Well, stability in a time where
is it countering AQ, or is it nation building? What is the goal?
What is that?
Well,
that's what I'm asking.
The lady asked the question.
Yeah.
That's okay.
So I think, but that depends entirely of what you're then going to do. So if you're going to structure to nation build, then that's that requires something much more substantial than what we've done, and we tend also to view this as a the automatic response of governments tend to be to the DOD or the MOD to give them the problem sort out. But actually, Afghanistan is not a military problem. No. Afghanistan is a socio-economic, political problem. So why do we ask the military to lead, and why do we expect them to deliver success? And actually not resource them to fulfil the mission anyway. Yeah. So, and then of course realpolitik kicks in, and you think, well, of course we're going to leave because Western populations and Western public won't tolerate 35 years. I mean, we're not going to be in Afghanistan in 2035, are we?
Dawood, can I ask you what you picked up from that film, and in particular in the banter and the way in which, a lot of the subject of that film was the police units there. Yeah. Can I ask you what you picked up from that film in particular?
Well, I think, as Will said, Sangin is a front line. The priority for places like Sangin is to secure the area, not to lose the area to the Taliban. This is the priority. There is no supervision of the commander of the police force in that area, or supervision is very weak. So this is, if you go to Kandahar or the provincial capital in Helmand, Lashkargah, police force is very different. I went on a patrol with the police force in Lashkargah. They are very professional. There's supervision on what they do, who do they arrest, what do they smoke. There's a lot of supervision in other parts of the country. So this is a true picture of one base, which is in Sangin. But if you are talking about the bigger picture, it is different. It depends. A police checkpost in Kandahar, somewhere in Kandahar, will be different from this checkpost in Sangin. And the number of Afghan police force is now 150,000. And as far as I've seen the development, most of them have been trained. Some of them can read and write. Some of them are very professional. But unfortunately, there are problems like this in many parts of the country, especially in those areas which are insecure. And they are not supposed to fight. This is the basic question. They are there for law enforcement. They are not there to fight the Taliban. But they are fighting, they are engaged in active fighting. This is not the job of a police force to do.
The police force haven't prosecuted a single case in 2 years.
Yeah, they are doing the wrong job in the first place. But as I said earlier, this is not the priority at the moment. The priority is just to hold the Taliban at that point where they are now. And this has been the priority since the US troops took over from the British troops in 2010. I was in Kabul when they...
So how do you think the police will hold up after we leave and take all of that equipment, the medical equipment, the surveillance equipment, the planes, helicopters, all that's going to be gone very soon?
it will be difficult, but I think the main problem for police force in areas like Sangin is leadership. So they need good commanders. If you give them good commanders, so he'll be able to be a role model and to lead his men properly. I mean, there are a lot of drug addicts, as you showed in your film, and there are many drug addicts in other parts of the country who join the police force, mainly because they cannot find drugs easily. It's an easy way to find drugs because there is drug trafficking going on in some parts of the country, so they can interdict drugs somewhere and then they just keep some of it. So I think they can hold in most areas. They might lose some district headquarters, they might lose Sangin, it is possible, but that will be for a while. Then they will send a force, maybe 2,000, 3,000, then they can recapture that. So this will go on for the next few years, especially after the withdrawal of foreign forces. They might lose some district headquarters and then they will recapture some of them.
Can I hear some more reactions to the film? The gentleman here.
My question is to Ben. It's Spin Tanai from BBC, and I was also helping with the translation of some those pictures. My question to Ben is that he was also in 2006 in Sangin, and he was doing similar film in that area. What is your impression after spending billions of pounds in Afghanistan by American and its British and foreign allies, and also you might also hear from the locals that there were £1 billion of war spent. What is your opinion actually from 2006 and 2013? Are there visible changes you could see or the same?
I mean, honestly, I can't think of any progress I've seen. And I haven't just travelled to Sangin, I've travelled all over Helmand and Kandahar as well. And the thing that always haunts me is, I think, imagine if we'd spent 5-10% of the billions we've spent on the military effort, because most of that money is spent on protecting ourselves, as in our own forces. When you look at the weaponry, the transport, the logistics, take 5-10% of that money and you look at what the Aga Khan or the International Committee of the Red Cross have done in Afghanistan, and just with a fraction of the money we've spent, I think we could have made the same gains that have been made across the country, and maybe far more gains. And I don't see this with any authority, but there wasn't an insurgency in the south until we went to the south. And I think there was a window very early on where maybe everybody wanted this to work, but by the time we were serious about nation building, it was far, far too late. And partly because of the rush to get to Iraq, we'd put in some of the worst people from Afghanistan's recent history, and so that combined with what I talked about before, there was something to fight against. I think we created that problem. But Sangin, every night there's firefights every night, there's IED explosions every night. There are as many casualties there as I've ever seen anywhere in Helmand. So I haven't seen any progress.
Ben is right. I mean, one American soldier cost $1 million a year in Afghanistan. 1,000 soldiers cost $1 billion a year. So it's a lot of money. So you can have 100,000 Afghan men for $1 billion a year. So a lot of money was spent on equipment and salaries and aeroplanes and other things.
And it's worth noting, I think, that last month was the first month that there had been no American casualties, no American deaths, in fact. So things are being drawn down quite rapidly. There's a gentleman at the back there that wants to speak.
Hello there, my name's Frank Ledwidge. I was Justice Advisor in Helmand in 2007 and 8. And first thing, Ben, that was a really heroic film for a number of reasons, I would suggest. Not least because I suspect quite a few people in Britain will be wondering why we haven't seen this kind of reporting before. And I've got a question to Dawood about this. Most of us who've served or worked in Helmand for longer than a week, not on embeds, are fully aware of the way the police is, and also of the way that many Helmandis think of their police, and indeed think of their army, and think of the British effort. It's cost us way over £30 billion so far. 2010 dollars, by the way, it was $32 billion to reconstruct Germany. I'm wondering whether Dawood would consider that the BBC, particularly, has failed in its duty to report impartially on what's been happening with this money, with our soldiers' lives, and with the vast effort that we put into Helmand, and that perhaps there may well be something more to the superb reporting that Ben's done over the years that could have been reported by the BBC. In other words, has the BBC been co-opted?
Okay, I mean that does leave aside the question of what actually advisors and other people were actually doing there as well. I hope you're not skipping that point.
If I might make, I was an advisor. Do you mean an advisor, a civilian advisor?
Yes, I'm saying that the problems are the problems, and the reporting of the problems is a different issue.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm not representing the BBC here. I'm here in my individual capacity, but we have covered these issues many times. When I was in Kabul, we covered these issues. When I came back to London, we have been covering these issues regularly. But this is also a BBC report. I mean, Panorama is also a BBC documentary.
It's the first time, though, we've seen this on the BBC since
No,
Ben's last report.
So this is what I'm saying, that this is not the first time we have been covering stories in different ways. Maybe this is a different format to cover that story. We have been covering this problem in many different formats.
On the same point.
Royal,
Let's just continue this discussion for a moment. We'll hear a few more comments from the floor.
Hello, so I'll declare my hand. I commanded the battle group in Sangin in 2009 to 2010 when there were 1,400 British troops in Sangin and Kajaki. A very powerful film, of course. I can pick up on issues of Sangin through the years and perhaps on BBC reporting. I see that we sort of continue to reinforce the British media's current obsession with sexual abuse. Maybe I could get into the second best obsession, which is the debate between Newsnight and Panorama. Maybe I'll come to that later on. But I think during 2009-2010, I would say it, Sangin was a completely different picture from that. I left the Army a while ago. I'm not an apologist for the British Army's performance there, or for, you'll be glad to hear, American or US or international policy. If you want to throw away comment, I think the minute we declared that our primary aim was to leave Afghanistan, then we need to think pretty carefully about what chances of success we've got. That's another story. I think in terms of the program itself, very powerful. I would like to sort of balance out with Will's point. You know, where is the context? Sangin is very much on the extreme. Going to the Newsnight Panorama thing, Mark Urban came out and did a pretty balanced piece, I thought, when I was there in 2000, and I think it was March 2010, almost exactly 3 years ago. Didn't paint a particularly pretty picture of Sangin and didn't say that it was good or bad, just reported it. I think this clearly sends a very powerful message, to which I'm sure there'll be a reaction. I haven't had anything to do with Afghanistan since I left there in April 2010. I would be surprised if the snapshot we've had in this very powerful and well put together program represents the situation in Afghanistan.
Well, as I said, I've travelled all over Helmand and Kandahar, and it absolutely represents. I mean, there's plenty of Afghans in the audience. I'll ask them. I don't think they'll be surprised by the stories.
I think even you would agree that it's probably on the extreme, but I confess that I haven't been there for 3 years.
That at all.
Okay, we'll come back to that point. There's a lady just there that'd like to speak.
Hello, when I was in Afghanistan, I asked my colleagues in the army that how the operations are done, and some of them say that when an operation is done, most in the front line, they are always Afghan army, and they are at the back, they are the international, or they operate mostly when there is the air, the helicopters. And also, as you said, there are many casualties for the Afghan army, but it's not said so much on the news. So as we see this film, it shows that now Afghan army and police cannot do anything. What kind of message it gives? It gives that they are just capable of nothing. But as we see that Afghan army is covering most of the Afghanistan right now. But I just wanted to know your view, what your message from this film?
I mean, it's very much Afghan-led in the southern provinces now. I covered Operation Mushtarak in Marja in 2010, and the claim was that was Afghan-led, and that was the most absurd claim I've ever heard. I mean, literally, the US Marines would drag a few Afghan soldiers along with them reluctantly and treated them like dogs. I mean, treated them awfully. Now things are genuinely Afghan-led, and there are Afghan. I think, according to the Pentagon, anyway, 1% of the Afghan army can operate completely independently. And when you take away all of the air support that we provide, it's very difficult to see them holding out. But the army, I mean, certainly Hamid Khan, the man you saw in there, if he saw his men doing any of the things the police were doing, I'm sure he would castigate them and kick them out immediately. But the police, I'd love to hear your view on this, that the police are behaving so badly across Kandahar and Helmand that it reminds me of what I've read, and I wasn't there, but about Afghanistan in the early 90s, and certainly, Helmand and Kandahar, where people welcomed the Taliban as a bulwark against this kind of violence and corruption and the sexual abuse of children, which, I'm not obsessed with the sexual abuse of children. If I've got that footage, of course I'm going to include it in the programme. But that, Mullah Omar's first serious operation was because someone had raped a young girl. And it feels like the conditions are very similar for people to welcome a return of the Taliban, certainly in the southern provinces. And that's what really worries me. And again, I wasn't there in the early 90s. I'd love to hear if you think there are any similarities.
This is Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, before Taliban and during the Taliban. I mean, problems like this existed, and that's how the Taliban got support from local population, because the Taliban were against people like you showed in your film. But as I said earlier, within the structure of the Interior Ministry, there are many different forces. There's the Afghan local police force, there's the Afghan national police force, there's the Afghan counter-narcotics police force, there's the public protection police force. So, and all of them are not very well organized, all of them are not well supervised. But if we say that all the Afghan policemen are behaving like the ones that you showed, I mean, it wouldn't be true. As you said earlier, 85% of the operations are now Afghan-led, but there are NATO forces in most of those operations. So there has been a lot of development. A lot of territory was captured from the Taliban, especially over the past 2-3 years since the surge took place, the US military surge took place in 2010. But the Afghan Interior Ministry, I think, is aware of these problems. Earlier this month they announced a 10-year strategy to reform the police force. So they mentioned corruption, they mentioned drug addiction. They acknowledge, even today we spoke to them, we spoke to the Interior Ministry about your report. They said that we are aware of these problems. Yes, we acknowledge there are some individuals, but it's not a widespread problem, and we are trying to tackle this problem. So nobody is denying that this is not happening. This is happening, but this is happening in some parts of the country, in some checkposts, not in every checkpost.
I would argue it is widespread, and also the NDS, the Afghan government has just admitted that half of prisoners handled by the NDS have been tortured after first denying it. It's, there are massive problems that are far more widespread than just Sangin or some of the worst places in Helmand.
Torture is, different from...
Okay, but it's another problem.
I'm going to try and bring some people in from the audience here, because I think there's a lot of people who want to say something. There's a gentleman here, and then followed by a gentleman over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, a former UK customs officer who's worked with law enforcement agencies in the ex-Soviet countries, including Central Asia, and I can't help note that although the politics was very different, the tactical circumstances we were hearing about a few years ago were remarkably similar to what my colleagues were telling me, for those considerable numbers who'd served in Afghanistan. I can't help wonder whether maybe there had been some opportunities lost to pick ideas, albeit realising that's difficult, or was difficult then. My question is relating to the point in the film about how the personnel were largely from the north. Could you just confirm, was that the army or the Afghan National Police? It obviously wasn't the local police. And
the army, yeah.
It was from the army. How much progress has been made in sort of winning them over to operate with more trust in the South? And what implications does that have after 2014 for a possible de facto, not separation, but maybe regionalisation of Afghanistan? Thank you.
I mean, it certainly feels to me like it's an exaggeration to call it the Afghan National Army. It still feels to me like a Northern Alliance dominated army. And I know there are 35-40% Pashtuns in the National Army, but Southern Pashtuns, it's 2 or 3%. And certainly civilians I've spoken to in the South have said they see the Afghan National Army as sometimes as being almost as foreign as the British or the Americans. And I think that's a major problem, because it feels like it's still divided along the same kind of lines as problems from the past. I mean, again, I'd be interested to hear what you think of that. But I said to Hamid Khan, the commander there, because he's got pictures of Dostum and Masood everywhere, which is not a good sign when you're going into the Pashtun South.
Back in 2006, the Afghan police, certainly in Sangin, was widely regarded as sort of beyond the pale. The Afghan army, although we didn't have many of them, were much more respected, irrespective of where they were from. But I had 4 of them actually with me in 2006, so we didn't have enough of them. But I think the point is about, again, it comes back to my point about what is the problem in Afghanistan. It's a socio-political problem. Sangin, as an example, has, I think, 3 tribes. And Nick, you probably know this better than I do, but 3 tribes interweaved amongst them, and a whole bunch of narcos and the Talibs and everything else in this melting pot that is this rather bad place. And so any security solution in that part of the country needs to engage with the power brokers in there, because if you don't have them on board, then it's just not going to work. And the police were crap, certainly, but they weren't being paid when I was there. And so you've got 40 policemen in a town of 60,000, with 3 warring tribes, a load of narcos and a load of Taliban, and you're dropped in there as the chief of police. And the only reason he actually accepted the job was that he didn't have to fight the Taliban. He's going to be a pragmatist, because he doesn't actually have any choice. And it comes back to the point about law and order creeping down from Kabul. What Afghanistan really needs is a lot of very brave, very courageous, high integrity people. But it's an awfully big place, there's not enough of those people. And so gradually they need to drip down into the places like Sangin to start providing the leadership and stop these horrors happening. But it's going to take a long time.
And you still have to pay for a senior position within the police force. And so you spend most of your time not doing law enforcement, not fighting the Taliban, but getting a return on that investment. And it's a massive investment, far more than the annual salary of a policeman.
The army has a good reputation. I mean, a much better reputation than the police force. But and it takes a lot of time. These are new institutions. They were established in a hurry. They were just recruited people from everywhere without vetting them properly, and it will take, I guess, a lot of time for that culture to develop, for the leadership to be established. And I was reading a report today that in 50 districts there are no courts. 50 districts of Afghanistan don't have proper courts. So there is an issue of governance, there is an issue of justice, there is no doubt about that. But if we are thinking of national institutions, I think the Afghan Army is the best national institution that the country has so far.
Okay, gentleman there.
But you are right, I mean, Southern Pashtuns are not represented properly.
Hello, thank you, Ben, for the wonderful film. My name is Rune Henriksen. I was a Norwegian officer serving in the north 4 tours, so I've been there in 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012. And I have to say the image that you portray of the police is completely accurate also from the north, which is supposed to be a safe area, which is also a lie, but the experience there is that the local people will come to whoever is a Westerner and they will beg us to intervene from the police who are stealing, raping, kidnapping, all the rest of it. You've heard it yourself. So I'm very surprised that people portray this as an isolated very special image in a marginal district of Helmand province, because this is completely widespread. Anyone who's spent much time in the villages or in the field in Afghanistan will agree with this. So I suppose my question is to Dawood, where do you get this impression that this is an outlier, as it were?
I said that these things happen in the periphery, in places like Sangin, but these things don't happen in the cities, because they can't do that. Even if they want to do these things, they cannot take drugs openly. They can't do that because there's a lot of supervision. The command structure is much stronger in the main cities, so it's hard for them to do these things. But you are right. I mean, I've seen things like this in the north, in the west, in the south, in the east. It is there. Nobody is denying that. But if you think that the whole police force is like that, so that's not a true reflection of that.
Yeah, I suppose what we'd disagree about is whether this is a matter of scale or it's a qualitative issue between utter hopelessness.
Thank you. You made your point very well with the lady at the back there.
Hi, thank you. We were just touching on a second ago the Taliban from the 1990s and the quite potent sort of message that Mullah Omar came in with, sort of hanging up all of the drug addicts and the rapists that were sort of in charge at that point in time. How much do we actually know about who makes up the Taliban in Sangin province now? I mean, I don't really know very much about who their leaders are, whether it's still made up of sort of Talib students from sort of the madrasas of Pakistan, or whether the same problems that the Afghan police force have with sort of disaffected youths taking drugs, etc. Is that actually happening within the sort of body that makes up the Taliban in these places at the moment?
I mean, I feel very lazy just for using the phrase Taliban. I mean, I think Taliban probably describes 30, 40 different groups now. And I think in the south, we're probably describing angry farmers who just want us and in many cases the Afghan government out of their back gardens. You know, are they taking directions from Mullah Omar from Pakistan? I very much doubt it.
You're certainly saying you have got three tribes basically. You've got all the narco people, then you've got homegrown Taliban who were probably just paid, I don't know, $50 to go and have a crack, and then you did have some that came across from Pakistan. So you've got a real melting pot of different intents and so on. And some of these people might just be fighting us because they don't like authority. You know, it's their land, it's a feudal society, they don't want any authority there, whether it's foreign or local.
So there are different motivations. Some of them are local villagers. Some of them are farmers who want to cultivate opium poppies. And if there is government treat is established there, so they wouldn't be able to do that. And some of them are there to take revenge because their village was bombed or a police commander arrested or killed one of their relatives. And some of them are motivated fighters who come from other parts of the country or from across the border. So it's very mixed picture. And all of them are, of course, Taliban. I mean, they are insurgent or part of the insurgency. But I don't think it's very tribal. I mean, tribal differences are there. But if there were tribal differences, so Taliban also make the same, they also represent the same tribes. So if there was a strong divide on tribal lines, so Taliban would not have had members from all these tribes. So why aren't they fighting against each other when they become Taliban? So all of these tribes that we'll mention are represented in the Taliban too. But it's mainly injustice, it's money, it's ideology, it's revenge.
Okay, nobody's mentioned Bin Laden yet, which is a bit worrying, isn't it? Because that's probably why we went there. Gentleman there. Yeah.
You'll forgive the history lesson, but Sangin is about 30 miles from Maiwand, which in 1880 saw the decimation of a British force. And I was serving in Sangin, north of Sangin, in Fob Inkerman from October 09 to March 10, and many of the people in that area thought we were back to reclaim our honour from the Battle of Maiwand. the memory goes in hundreds of years rather than in single years in that part of the world. Secondly, I think what's come out very clearly is a very different view between Afghan counterinsurgency and the British idea of counterinsurgency. The control of the districts is not as important to Afghans as it is to the Brits. We don't like ceding land that we've gone to, hence why in 2006 you end up in Sangin and you stay there beyond all reasonable hope. The Afghans are quite prepared to cede that and then come back at a later date, it would seem, from friends who are currently serving there. Thirdly, I think the very sensitive issue of homosexuality, where in Afghanistan clearly homosexuality is illegal, but culturally is totally acceptable to have chai boys. And I will relate very quickly a story of sitting in a shura where the Afghan commander said to a local group of elders, if your head is in the sea or near the sea, which the Afghans have a very strong fear of, and I am standing naked behind you, which one are you going to choose? And the elders fell about with laughter because they understood exactly the choice that they were having to make, and that they totally accepted what the result was going to be. And it couldn't have been clearer, and something I would never have been able to say, but something that he was able to say because he knew what the local culture and the local acceptable. The final point, and this is the real tragedy of Sangin, is that we were negotiating with the Taliban. We did have an opportunity for peace in 2010, and that is fairly publicly known as a result of the work of Phil Wetherell and others. And the tragedy is we threw it away, and Sangin didn't need to be like that.
I was actually in Sangin when that peace deal was supposed to be signed on Boxing Day, I think it was 2010, and it fell apart. They
first came into my company and said, you've been honourable warriors and we wish to talk.
Well, I mean, I'd go beyond on saying, I'd say back in 2006 we got it all wrong in the province as a whole. Because had we applied some of the sound principles of counterinsurgency properly before we went into Helmand, the whole destruction and the blood feuds and the rest of it that we helped create there might not have existed. Well, we made Musakala, Sangin, Nowzad, Gomsir and other towns that actually have no real importance to the control of Helmand province, iconic. And a lot of people died, ours and theirs, for not much gain.
I'm going to start winding up fairly soon, but there's still a few more comments. Stephen, you wanted to make a quick comment, and then the person just there, yes.
Just quickly, I also spent a bit of time in these areas. What you saw, though, the gentleman who was commander in Sangin, I didn't catch your name, but in reaction to your point, I think you make a good point in a sense that it is difficult to judge Britain's effort in Sangin, because in a way, what happened in Sangin is and what you see there is almost deliberate, because there was a decision to fold back, that we extended ourselves too far. And a couple of years ago, there was a change of strategy to actually say, well, we should concentrate more about the centre areas, Lashkargah, Marja, where previously there wasn't much happening. That in itself was a sort of proof of what had gone wrong before. But the fact that Sangin, if you like, is to a certain degree chaos, was because Britain decided to retrench back and try and make the centre work on the basis that a counterinsurgency strategy really had to be based upon securing the centre first and then spreading out. So there's two questions really that remain. Can an Afghan state tolerate this kind of level of chaos on the fringes, which we're seeing in all those places, when you step out from the centre? Can they tolerate that? And, is this whole thing sustainable, or is the centre really as secure as you're saying, and you're not saying, as we saw also in your film in Marja? Because if the centre is as decrepit as what's happening in Sangin, then that is a really big problem.
Lady here.
Hi, yeah, this is just a question for Ben. The guys you spoke to from the Afghan National Police, what do they think is going to happen when the Western forces pull out? Because I mean, it didn't look like they were particularly committed to the training for the police. So, but presumably they're going to be the ones literally in the firing line when the Western forces leave. But I mean, were they excited about the future? Were they depressed about it? What do they think the consequences?
I have to be honest. I didn't have that many conversations. But the main fear they have is equipment. I mean, I didn't really make a point of it in the film, but I think it's scandalous that we're leaving them with rusty old AK-47s, unarmoured jeeps, and very little else. I mean, if we can't put down the Taliban with all the equipment, all the bomb-proof trucks, Apaches, F-16s, everything else, all the surveillance equipment, then what on earth chance does even a well-trained police and army have if all they've got is rusty old AK-47s, RPGs, and unarmoured pickup trucks? That was their main complaint. I think they think if they're well-equipped, they stand a chance. If they stay with the levels of equipment they've got now, then they don't think they've got any chance. And I was very depressed when a really good, trusted Afghan friend watched the film and said half the police will vanish as soon as the Marines leave and the other half will join the Taliban. It's not my view, that was his view, and that was a very depressing thing to hear.
But lasting security isn't achieved by soldiers or policemen on corners. It's achieved by the local population deciding that they want to live in a secure place. So otherwise all we're doing is containing. It's a containment thing. So, I think the success or not of Afghanistan will be found in a number of years' time, and it's really whether Afghan local officials and national officials stand up and be counted and start to apply some basic rules of delivering basic services to its people and basic law and order. If they start doing that, then there's a chance and security will come because the people will see it, and then they'll depose the Taliban from the villages. If they don't do that, it will be the SWAT province or whatever.
There has been a 3-point strategy. One is to talk to the Taliban. So if there is a reconciliation by the end of 2014 or by 2015, so that will reduce the level of violence dramatically if that happens. So the second strategy is to improve governance. President Karzai a few months ago issued a special decree mainly focused on improving governance in every sector, from judiciary to police to other institutions. And the third strategy is to improve the quality of Afghan security forces. And they've been asking NATO for proper equipment, especially the Air Force, which Afghanistan doesn't have at the moment. I mean, they have some aeroplanes, some helicopters, but you cannot call it a proper Air Force. So they have this 3-point strategy. And the best hope that they have so far is to reach some sort of political settlement with the Taliban. And I guess in the next few months, the Taliban will open a formal office in Qatar. So that will become the main point of contact with the Taliban. And John Kerry is in London today, I think. He's also visiting Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So I guess he will also talk about the opening of an office for the Taliban. So this is the hope that the Afghan government and the international community has to reach some sort of settlement with the Taliban.
I'm going to take a couple more comments from the floor, and then I think I'll ask Ben to answer some of the points that have been made. Gentleman there.
It's been a very depressing few weeks, what with Giles Dooley's film the week before, talking about the lack of hospitals for civilian population in Kabul, and then Ben's film tonight. I'm curious to know what people think about the politicians and all this that are making these decisions. And also in terms of the families of soldiers who have lost their lives for what is a very depressing outlook for the future. I'm just curious to know what people think about the politicians' role in all this mess.
Thank you. Any other final comments? Gentleman here.
Thanks. I'm just curious about the effect on morale of having to shore up these people that are, I mean, I'm talking about the British American troops' morale of having to shore up people that are clearly engaged in very unpleasant activities. I mean, how did your guys react when you said, we're going to go and rescue a rapist? You know, somebody that here you'd be trying to, lock up. You say, hey guys, we've got to go and spend £1,000 an hour on helicopter fuel to fly a rapist out of danger. And, I mean, that seems an impossible thing to ask of people.
Well, I mean, I obviously don't couch it quite in that way, so...
very briefly, please.
Yeah, we're obviously going into Sangin to build the Afghan state and the rest of it. So but the soldiers aren't stupid. You know, they're very streetwise and clock on things quite quickly. It's difficult, you know, and it's. But I think that, you know, the morale actually was, certainly in my experience, was always very high, because you have the bond of, you know, the 100 or so blokes that I had was very close. So that is the sustaining bit, that as long as that's coherent, then they're sort of okay. You do have the pressures of people sort of wondering what you're doing, and we had the same in Iraq with, you know, other issues like that. But I think, you know, generally we were trying to do good, and that was the sort of message that was through all the ranks. You know, I'm a parachuter, but there's lots of chat about us going out there to just have a fight. I mean, that's just rubbish. You know, we were generally there to try and build for the better, and that's the message that the soldiers had and believed in. So I think they believed they were doing something for good.
Yeah, I think it was William Blake that said the road to hell was paved with good intentions.
Yes.
But there you go. There's somebody down here. Yes, there.
Well, I'll speak without the microphone. I was a company commander in Sangin in 2009, 2010, and I returned last week from having spent 8 months in the ISAF Joint Command in Kabul. And so I would just make a few points that are...
Hello? Yeah. I'd make a few points that the view in Kabul is nowhere near as negative as we've generally had here. And I can't actually believe I'm going to defend what I sat doing in Kabul for eight months. But I think it's very important to understand the context. It's very important, as we've heard, but I want to reiterate that actually progress may be very difficult to see. But when I was in Sangin, the idea of being able to have just 2 lots of 18 Western troops on the ground at any one moment is just quite incredible. That is actually progress. Sangin is one of 403 districts. It actually would have been in transition, in the latest tranche of transitions, because we are actually seeing progress in Sangin. And with regard to the development of the ANSF, yes, or the Afghan National Security Forces, yes, it's easy to knock them. No, they're nowhere near the level of sophistication that we have. However, that doesn't mean to say that progress isn't being seen there. For all the wonderful air power, etc., surveillance that we bring, this week you've seen Karzai ask for no more US SF operations in Wardak. Wardak is a much greater concern to Afghanistan than Sangin district is, and indeed he's said that Western air power cannot be used by Afghan National Security Forces. What you're seeing is the Afghans actually beginning to step up to the plate. They are beginning to take their own sovereignty. ISAF no longer actually has the ability to conduct, a bit of an exaggeration, but it doesn't have much of a capability to conduct independent operations any longer. The ANA, the ANP are in the lead. It is working. The place is not falling apart. I'm not saying it's great, but I think perhaps a little bit of balance is required.
Well, thank you for making those balancing points. And I want to ask, we are almost out of time, I'm terribly sorry, but I want to ask Ben to come back. There's been a kind of comments from both sides here tonight, Ben. Some people saying, why didn't you say this along, some time ago? And other people here saying that you're completely misrepresenting. So I wonder if you can steer a course through those and tell us what your film is about, actually.
I mean, in terms of what you said, my view is irrelevant. I take what I say from the many Afghans I speak to, and every Afghan I speak to in every province, from Kabul and from the south, is terrified about the future and sees civil war as an almost certainty, with a strong chance the Taliban might take certainly the southern provinces and maybe even more than the southern provinces. That's what I think is the most important thing. In terms of governance, I think the most damning indictment is that most people in the south, and all I know really is Kandahar and especially Helmand, have always said to me, all we want is security and justice. They're the two most important things. And sadly, at the minute, for many of the people, the Taliban are doing a better job of providing security and justice than the Afghan security forces or that we have done.
By shooting girls in the head in Pakistan, for example.
No, I'm talking about the local. We can say Taliban in inverted commas, but I'm saying the local people. That there are courts. In Marja, before Marja, there was so much talk about we've got to free the people of Marja from the iron rule of the Taliban. So the first thing I did after the 5 or 6 days of fighting had died down was talk to every local I possibly could, and they all said, first of all, it was fine. There was no robbery, there was no theft. Children weren't abducted. And then secondly, when the Afghan National Community Order Police turned up 3 or 4 days later, they said, please don't leave us alone with those guys. And that speaks volumes.
Can I just ask you, Ben, what is the next film you're going to make?
I've got several projects I'm trying to get made in Afghanistan, but it's getting harder and harder to get backing to do films because public interest has sadly just dried up. I mean, I tried to go out to the Brits recently, and they didn't want me to go out with them for 3 or 4 months. And after this film, I'm sure they're not going to want me to go out with them. I've been trying to do some films with Afghans, and it's very difficult to back. I mean, I'm freelance. I'm not a BBC staffer or representative. I've worked for Channel 4, HBO, and the BBC, and it's very hard to get anyone to back you and go out there and do any kind of story.
Well, we have actually run out of time. I'm very sorry to say that because it's been a very, very interesting discussion tonight. We have not solved the problems of Afghanistan patently. We have just begun to raise some of the issues which will be brought more and more into focus as the end of 2014 approaches, which is going to approach extremely rapidly. And I think there will be many more meetings here to discuss these kind of issues. Thank you all very, very much for coming along. Please thank the panel for a great presentation. Thank you very much.